Go. There we go. Got it.
Okay. Awesome. Okay.
Sure, you can put them in there. I like the art. I like the fact that they keep the art alive. No, this one's cool. What's that guy in New Orleans, Andy? It's a little like that Bates. That one's nice. That is too. We'll want you to go right now and come up front then.
Oh, well, let me go see.
All right. Hey, how you doing? Nice to see you.
Good to have you with us.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. It's my wife, Ann.
Hey, Ann, I hear you had an interesting flight.
Nice to meet you.
We both did.
One more person's come in.
I had the bouncy one in the Great Gainesville. I felt like it was heaven when we landed. Green everywhere, and there were.
Welcome. Thank you very much for coming out on Friday night in Gainesville at the end of the semester, on Passover, on Good Friday, on a horrible weather day, and competing with a Garth Brooks sound check in a little while as well. So we appreciate your choosing to spend some time with us here this evening, whether directly here physically or virtually. We welcome you, those of you who are viewing through our live stream as well. I'm Matt Jacobs. I'm the director of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service here at the University of Florida. I want to just take a couple of minutes. I'm relatively new in that position. This is kind of the biggest audience we've had since I've been here, just to say a couple of words about the center, to introduce it to maybe some of you who aren't as familiar with it. The Bob Graham Center has been around here since 2006. We've been here in this wonderful building since 2008. We are driven by three central principles: civic engagement, public service, and public leadership, and trying to help develop those skills in our students and equip our students to engage in those ways moving forward. And traditionally we've done that at the local and state level. Under my leadership, we'll be trying to expand that to the national and international level, basically under the guiding rubric that Florida's challenges are the world's challenges moving forward. 1 in 3 jobs in the state of Florida are connected globally. If you think about Miami, it's effectively a cultural and political capital of the Americas at this point. If you think about things like climate change, sea level rise, etc., Florida will be as impacted by those sorts of issues as any state in the country will be. In short, Florida's challenges are the world's challenges moving forward, and we look forward here at the Graham Center to helping to prepare our students as future employers, employees, citizens, and public servants to engage in those ways. As we start thinking about tonight's event, which I'm delighted to sort of introduce the event, I want to begin by thanking our sponsors. So in addition to the Bob Graham Center for Public Service, the Rothman Family Chair on the Humanities and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Gus Burns Memorial Fund of the Department of History, and the Department of Journalism and the College of Journalism and Communications have all provided the resources to allow tonight's event to happen. It's really difficult to imagine that this year marks the 50th anniversary of the landing on the moon. That's almost unfathomable for some of us at least. When you think about the opportunities that created here in the state of Florida, the growth and the development of the Space Coast, there are many parts of product of that event, right? That drove much of what happened here in the state of Florida along the Space Coast. If you think about the sunny mornings that school children went outside to watch yet another launch of a rocket or a shuttle, and maybe their parents went outside, maybe employers went outside, etc. Think about what that meant for this state and how transformative that has been for the state of Florida over time. As much as we think about that moment, though, of 1969 and its impact, what we often forget is the sense of vision that went into it. That it took to imagine the unimaginable. And that's one of the things that John F. Kennedy did for us back when he gave that first speech announcing the moonshot. That speech has gained a life of its own. In many ways, it's become a staple, along with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, of leadership, motivational speaking, development tours, all those kinds of things that sort of create this aura around the speech itself. And I'm delighted and excited to hear what our guest speaker tonight will have to say about the speech, the event, and so on. Finally, before we get to our speaker, I want to thank Cynthia Barnett, who's a joint fellow in faculty in the Bob Graham Center and in the College of Journalism, and Jack Davis, who is the Rothman Family Chair in the Humanities, who holds that chair. He's also faculty in the Department of History and is also the 2018 Pulitzer Prize winner in history for his book on the Gulf. They organized this event. This wouldn't have happened without their efforts. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Cynthia now to introduce our speaker. Again, thank you very much for being here, and thank you, Cynthia.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Jacob, and thank you so much, all of you, for coming out on one of our famously stormy days. I'm delighted to introduce my friend, Douglas Brinkley, a best-selling author, presidential scholar, and spokesperson for noble causes ranging from the conservation of great lands and waters to the making of great leaders. I'd like to begin, though, by acknowledging the person on American Moonshot's dedication page, and that is Anne Brinkley. She joins, you'll have to wave so people can see you, Anne. She joins her husband tonight from Austin where they are raising 3 children, where she helps Doug juggle author challenges like dodging tornadoes to get to lectures, and where she has co-authored works such as their Atlantic Monthly essay on the murder of Martin Luther King. To Anne and to all the partners in the room, thank you. A professor of history at Rice University, Douglas Brinkley is the author or editor of more than 20 books, from this new beauty on JFK and the American Moonshot, which shot to the New York Times bestseller list its first week out, to his excellent biography of Walter Cronkite, to his must-read epic of FDR's conservation legacy, which is called Rightful Heritage, and even the letters of gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson, who named Doug his literary executor. Doug is an atypical academic, roaming around with the likes of Thompson and Johnny Depp, and filling our screens as CNN's network historian. He once called me from Martha's Vineyard, where he was advising President Obama on national monuments. Through it all, Doug maintains a down-to-earth and generous character, both as a person and on the page. I first met him 5 years ago while in the brutal process of chasing blurbs for my latest book jacket. You make this lengthy list of big-name authors you strive to emulate, those you think would so get your book if only they would read it. You send vast batches of emails asking these authors if they'd take a look and consider writing a blurb. You mostly never hear back. On a good day, you get a brief personal note saying, "Sorry, too busy." Doug Brinkley was the most prolific and I figured the most unlikely name on my list, but he turned out to be one of the most generous. Not only did he read an unknown stranger's manuscript, but he thought deeply enough about it to write one of my favorite blurbs. Soon after, I found myself in the bibliography of his next book, and next thing you know, I was on the receiving end of calls from Martha's Vineyard. What drew me to Doug's work in the first place was that same generosity as a researcher and a writer. Too often, historians, present company excluded, leave out journalists who toiled over the first drafts of history, writing instead the New York Times reported or the Chicago Tribune headline blared. Doug is not that type of historian. In his vivid narrative from the lawless first 5 days of Hurricane Katrina, the Great Deluge, Doug put names, flesh, and tears to the reporters and editors of the New Orleans Times-Picayune. In his environmental histories, including Wilderness Warrior and Rightful Heritage, readers get to know the likes of Century Magazine editor Robert Underwood Johnson, who helped Teddy Roosevelt and FDR articulate a new environmental ethic that helped shape the nations. Likewise, in American Moonshot, Doug names and animates the astrophysicists, the computer scientists, the mechanical engineers, the journalists, and yes, the speechwriter who phrased a president's immortal dreams. In bringing to life the men and women who lived American dreams on rocket ships and in many other ways, Douglas Brinkley lifts us all. Please join me in welcoming him to the University of Florida.
That was amazing. What a beautiful, beautiful introduction from the heart. And Cynthia has become a dear friend of mine. Her work is just beautiful and impeccable. And I was moved when I read about it. And I thought it was fitting. It was raining when I was floated down today. And Jack Davis is one of the great historians in America. I always wanted to come here to talk on environmental history. And today's my first day. Oh, sorry. I sounded loud even without it. Hello? How's that, guys? No? Oh, you mean to do it on this? Okay. All right. How's that? Oh, I see. I don't need that at all. I always wanted to come here to talk on environmental history because that is my passion of the natural world. And I'm going back right now while I'm traveling on this book. I'm working on Silent Spring Revolution, Rachel Carson era 1960s environmental movement. But I took a break from environmental history to do this book, American Moonshot, and it has some, its DNA is really in my childhood, because I grew up in a town called Perrysburg, Ohio, near Toledo. And when Neil Armstrong went on the moon, it'll be 50 years ago, the big moment, this July 20th, that we'll all be looking at as a country. I was 8.5 years old, going to be 9, and but fairly soon. And my parents made me watch every moment of every hour of going to the moon. And part of the drama locally was Neil Armstrong was from Wapakoneta, Ohio, just down the road from where I grew up. My mom was an English teacher at Perrysburg High School. My dad is a history teacher in the public schools. And so we were a NASA obsessed family watching these feats. In Ohio, it's the Wright brothers. John Glenn was from Ohio, so it was sort of part of the feel that was going on in Wood County that summer. Cut to some years later, I earned my doctorate in history, and I'd written a biography of Dean Acheson and one of James Forrestal, who was the Secretary of Navy, first Secretary of Defense. And I had the temerity to mail them to Neil Armstrong. I got his P.O. box at a farm outside of Cincinnati from a reporter. He was famously reclusive. Not with a capital R, but a small r. He really despised the news media, wanted nothing to do with celebrity, felt that everybody else was responsible. He was one of 400,000 people who did the Apollo program. He was the exact opposite of the second person on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, who loved celebrityhood and all. They were like opposite figures. And I wrote him a letter sending him 2 of my books signed and said, "Dear Mr. Armstrong, I grew up not that far from you in Ohio, and I don't have an exact project in mind right now, but I would love to interview you about your Korean War history and growing up in Ohio," that kind of letter. And I got back a short little note card from his personal assistant that said, "Mr. Armstrong will read one of your books." I sent him 2. And he doesn't do interviews, but he'll keep you in mind if the occasion arises, kind of letter. A very polite blow-off. I sort of forgot that I had the temerity to do that, and about 6 to 7 years later, I got a phone call from NASA saying Neil Armstrong was turning 70 and they wanted me to do the official oral history of him for NASA at Johnson Space Center in Houston. Armstrong's assistant had filed me away as the Ohio guy, and NASA, they wanted somebody younger. I'm not so young now, but at the time, this was 2001. I got the deal. He agreed to NASA to do one interview, Armstrong, all day, no rules. Ask, that's it, NASA, leave me alone. That was his attitude. And so it was right before my scheduled time with Mr. Armstrong was right when 9/11 happened. I was with Ann, we were watching in New Orleans the towers coming down, and among all the other emotions one had at that time, I also thought, there goes my Neil Armstrong interview, because all airspace was shut down. It was just a lockdown mode in the country. And I called NASA and said, "God, are we going to reschedule? What do I do?" And he said, "Oh no, Neil never cancels anything." I said, "Really?" He's going to go, "Oh yeah." And I said, "Well, how is he getting there?" He goes, "Well, he'll fly himself." So I drove from New Orleans to Houston, I'll always remember it, at this like little NASA place there by a runway. When Armstrong, flying his own plane down, lands, like walks out, comes in, says hello, and they had a little mic set up, and we said go, and I got to interview him for 6 hours. I was with him for 8 hours. So that kind of made me think about space, and as life in the academic world has it, I was at Tulane, and I moved to Rice University in Houston. And Rice, where I teach, is where John F. Kennedy, on September 12, 1962, gave this famous speech when he said, "We choose to go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard." And gave this extraordinary speech in a football stadium of 40,000 people. 10,000 were Boy Scouts in uniform. And gave this amazing speech about public discovery, about science education, about exploration, about our solar system, about our galaxy being the new sea waiting to be explored. It's an extraordinary presidential speech Kennedy gave at my university. And out of that reality, when I'm at Rice, I decided to write this book, American Moonshot, to reflect. And I had one big question, guys, I focused on in writing this book out of the gate. Why did John F. Kennedy put all of his credibility on the number it cost $25 billion, Apollo, which is $185 billion today, to go to the moon when we didn't have the technology to go to the moon? What motivated him? And that got me on a very unusual journey. John F. Kennedy is born in 1917 in Brookline, Massachusetts. And at the time that he was born, he was a child of the 20th century. When you think later about presidents and leaders he interacts with, they were all born in the 19th century. Khrushchev's 19th century, Eisenhower 19th century, de Gaulle 19th century, Churchill 19th century. Kennedy is a 20th century jet age man. In the sense that aviation was a big deal. When he was my age, when I experienced Neil Armstrong, Kennedy's watching Charles Lindbergh cross the Atlantic in 1927. He was the Armstrong of the 20s, this incredible hero of the skies. And at that same time in his childhood, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon became a big deal. Comic books and radio shows about space exploration. CBS News started running an astronomy course on radio that you would take, and people were asking, could we go to the moon someday? Can we go to Mars? Science fiction became a very robust kind of pulp book industry. And more to the point, the first missile guy in America, the first human in the U.S. that really focused on missiles is Robert Goddard. And Goddard's experiments were at Clark University, not far from Brookline in Massachusetts. And it's there during Kennedy's youth that Dr. Goddard does the first liquid fuel rocket. Up until that time, people would blast out of rockets like using gunpowder effect, a cannon effect. Goddard created liquid fuel rockets. He gets arrested and written up for noise making for his rockets in Auburn, a cabbage field in Auburn, Massachusetts. And then he tries to embed with the Army a little, Goddard, and then eventually he moves to Roswell, New Mexico, where if you hear about aliens in Roswell, it's because Dr. Goddard was out there firing things up in the New Mexican skies on cowhands and ranchers, and locals started seeing them. And it was a strange phenomenon. But he was it. We had one top rocketeer, and he couldn't get any funding. You know who was funding rockets in the 1920s? The Weimar Republic in Germany, and then Hitler's Third Reich. The Germans were rocket mad. They wanted rocketry, was this passion there. In World War II, we put money into atomic weapons with the Manhattan Project, and Hitler puts it into missiles. And they had a rocketeer operating on similar principles as Robert Goddard in New Mexico, only much more sophisticated than Goddard, and that is Werner von Braun.
Von Braun comes, like Kennedy, came from an aristocratic family of wealth. Von Braun comes from a baron. His father had been an agriculture minister in the Weimar Republic. He went to all the best technical schools. And honest to God, guys, I don't use the word genius in my life. I almost ban it. But von Braun was a rocket genius. At age 16 to 18, people knew it. He was arrested for putting rockets on a wagon in Berlin that created all this havoc. And when the Third Reich comes into power, when Hitler comes into power, many of the best rocket scientists flee Nazi Germany because they know what Hitler is. Von Braun is an opportunist who sees that Hitler's going to fund his rockets, so he stays, and they build the biggest rocket compound on the Baltic to start his experiments. And boy, did he track. He builds weapons of mass destruction for Adolf Hitler. They're called vengeance weapons. The V1, the V2, and the V3 in World War II. And von Braun, during World War II, is the first human ever to put a projectile, anything to leave humans, to leave Earth's gravity and to go into outer space. We had never been in outer space before. He was able to put a rocket into space, and then the V2 got hurried up and developed in 44 and early 45, and they rained V2 bombs on London. Ann and I brought our 3 kids to go in London to the Churchill Roy Room, and the whole story there in Great Britain are the rockets and von Braun's vengeance weapons aiming to wipe London off the map. It kills thousands of civilians. Some were errant bombs because they didn't have precision rocketry. Incidentally, these rockets of von Braun have been written about. Michael Chabon wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, or a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist wrote about it. Thomas Pynchon writes about it. In fiction, these von Braun missiles coming, we had no missiles. I love FDR. He's my favorite president. On the missile thing, FDR didn't want to fund it. It seemed too sci-fi. Well, by 45, when the Third Reich's crumbling post D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, and it's clear that Germany's going to collapse, von Braun, who was in the SS, von Braun, who used Jewish slave labor to build his rockets from the Dora camp, which was the sub-camp of Buchenwald. Von Braun was a prime target to be charged for war crimes. And I write in my book about the Dora camp and the heinous Holocaust, horrific conditions. And what happened to the Jewish laborers, they were dying one after the other because they were having to work 24-hour shifts to get these missiles, which became Hitler's last great hope. And von Braun makes a very smart decision that he better make a deal with the United States government. He doesn't want to work in Russia for Stalin. And in London, in Britain, he's bound to be tried for war crimes. So he takes all of his V2 blueprints, his missile parts, all of the technology and intelligence, and 137 of the top rocket missile scientists, and they take a train and go to, they forge some documents. It's a longer story. You can read it in the book or look elsewhere. But he ends up burying all this in a mountain, and they blow up the front of it. Then they leave that area, and they hide out in an Olympic Bavarian Alp test hotel. And he sends his younger brother, Werner von Braun, on a bicycle to surrender to the U.S. Army. Magnus von Braun does. A guy from Sheboygan, a private from Sheboygan, Wisconsin's putting a gun on him. And he's like, my brother's Werner von Braun. We have all of the missile technology hidden. Please let me talk to Army intelligence. He spoke English. That was one of the reasons he became a front person. And a deal was cut for von Braun and all the Nazi scientists to move to the United States under Operation Paperclip, in exchange for not being charged They became what our government called prisoners of peace, and they moved to Fort Bliss, Texas, near El Paso, to work on what we call today the White Sands Proving Grounds, by where Dr. Goddard and Roswell and all of that, to test missiles and start working for the United States. Von Braun has to do a makeover from being a Nazi, and so he'll go to like the El Paso Rotary Club and talk about going to the moon, Mars, trying to, and at this time, many people were looking at who's a good German and a bad German. And von Braun just quietly works for the U.S. Army out there. We weren't putting money into missiles, even though we had von Braun in them. In the Korean War, when Harry Truman's president, we have the best military aviation going. Our Air Force is amazing in Korea. It was a new branch of the armed services as of 1947. And guys like Neil Armstrong flew like 38 combat missions in Korea, extraordinary planes that were developed in Hampton, Virginia, with wind tunnels and anti-icing. And so we had an aviation fleet, but we neglected missiles. And suddenly there became a call by a lot of people. Where are American missiles? The problem that only time in world history one country has a nuclear monopoly is the United States from 45 to 49. But Russia gets the A-bomb. And then Russia has hydrogen weapons. And we find out Russia is building this big missile program. And von Braun starts becoming valuable more than ever. And we move all of the Nazi rocket scientists to Huntsville, Alabama, in what we call today Rocket City, USA. And working for the Army, they start figuring new kinds of rockets and how to put satellites into space. And the problem von Braun has is Dwight Eisenhower doesn't like him. Eisenhower had famously ordered film companies, Army, to film the Holocaust camps, to film Auschwitz and Buchenwald and all this. Eisenhower truly knew how horrific Nazi Germany was in trying to create genocide. And so even though von Braun was in the U.S. Army, Eisenhower looked elsewhere for missile development, mainly the Navy. And then guess what? If you ever look here at Cape Canaveral and see these rockets that are starting to take off and crumble, those are Vanguard rockets built by the Navy. And von Braun is livid because I can do it. I make better rockets. They're not green lighting me. He starts really having an animosity to President Eisenhower in the 1950s for not green lighting him. He was a megalomaniac mind, von Braun. Also became great at media in the 50s. Walt Disney hires him to be on his television show to do Rockets of Tomorrow and Tomorrowland and space. He becomes Disney's futurist. Collier's magazine puts von Braun, he does articles for him. He's a very good writer. And he's doing a imagery lift, right? And now, it might sound far-fetched, guys, but in 1953, he's chosen to be the judge for Time Magazine's Person of the Year, Man of the Year. And he was a judge, von Braun, to choose it with a young senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, who just won in 1952. 53 Times Person of the Year is chosen with Kennedy and von Braun hanging out together in New York as judges, and they choose Konrad Adenauer, the new Chancellor of West Germany. There's a big attempt in America to bring West Germany in, and it's an ally. The Cold War's on. Adenauer's good. He's one of the good Germans. Von Braun got to help promote West Germany versus East Germany. And everything, Kennedy and von Braun's meeting together becomes poignant. Because von Braun will later say, all Jack Kennedy did, he wanted to talk to me about his brother, Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy, his older brother, John F. Kennedy's older brother, while Jack Kennedy served in the Pacific in the Solomon Islands campaign and ran a PT-109 boat that split in two, while Kennedy became a war hero in the Pacific, his brother flew combat missions in Europe as a Navy aviator. So many, over 35 successful missions, that he was a hero in his own right, but he was asked to go on a top secret mission called Operation Aphrodite. So Joe Kennedy says, sign me up. He's built, the Kennedy's father taught these boys to push and win and service, and Joe Kennedy has to go like into a B-17 plane, a big American military plane that they gutted the whole inside of the plane, packed it from top, nose to tail, filled with Torpax, which is a kind of dynamite, to make this, since we had no missiles in World War II, his mission was to fly the plane and aim it into the very southern coast of France where von Braun V1, V2, V3s were being assembled in a mountain. At least the US government thought it was the crucial building site. So he was going to run his plane into it to blow up von Braun missile site, and he was supposed to parachute out at the last minute. It was like a drone kamikaze kind of like thing, pre-drones, and instead he blows up in the sky. And Joe Kennedy is dead. And here it is, 53, Senator Kennedy's telling the architect his brother died trying to take out his weapons. And Kennedy's got no animosity towards him. Because Jack Kennedy figured, look, I'm an American, I served America. You're German, you served Germany. You're Japanese, you served Japan. Now in the 50s, Japan and Germany were our great allies. And we're pulling together, we're the grunts of World War II. This is important because in 1957 is the game-changing moment when the Soviets put Sputnik up. And when Sputnik goes up, it's the first satellite ever. We are all now, whether we realize or not, a satellite society in everything that we do. Here is the first one, and Russia does it. On Eisenhower's watch, and guess who's there to mock Eisenhower? Jack Kennedy calls it a missile gap with Russia. Von Braun saying, why didn't you let me go and do my thing? I could have had that satellite up a year ago if somebody greenlight me. And Eisenhower is calm about it all. And Ike says, we have enough technology. We have actually superiority with Russia. We're not getting into a weird race in space with them, okay? And he chilled a lot, but the political pressure from the opposition party, it's the Democratic hawks, Lyndon Johnson, Senator Henry Scoob Jackson, Stuart Symington of Missouri, Jackson was from Washington State, have an issue to pound on the Republicans. We are weak. We're losing science and technology and space and missiles to communism. This is McCarthy era kind of thing, and the Red Scare had been on, and McCarthy had been on, but America was in a fierce anti-communist mood. Kennedy hobby horses this issue all the way to win the Democratic nomination for president in 1960. And he wins it, and if you go in 1960, he runs against Vice President Richard Nixon. Most of you know, but if some don't. It's Kennedy-Nixon. And Kennedy uses this as an effective weapon to get reelected. Eisenhower's golfing at Augusta while America's losing the space race. In the debates, and incidentally, people will call the Kennedy-Nixon debates the first televised debates. They're the first presidential debates, period. You know, Lincoln-Douglas is not a presidential debate. It's an Illinois debate. This was a first ever presidential debates on TV, and Kennedy looked better. Nixon looked sweaty. And Kennedy had taken classes on how to look on TV from Walter Cronkite. So did Sam Rayburn, how to have makeup, how to look into the camera, how to be telegenic. Nixon never took those classes. And Kennedy, with great poise, scores 2 fighter punches hard on Nixon if you go back and watch the debates. One is at one moment, Kennedy says, last year you told Mr. Khrushchev that America is #1 in kitchen appliances. Well, I will take my TV in black and white. I want to be #1 in rocket thrust. And another moment, Kennedy says to Nixon, if you're elected president, I envision a Soviet flag planted on the moon. I want to see an American flag planted on the moon. Boom. Kennedy wounded him. And he wins by a hair. And he wins in part, barely wins Texas, John F. Kennedy, because he chose nemesis Lyndon Johnson to be his vice president. And Kennedy still only barely wins. But at any rate, it's Kennedy and Johnson. And what happened, guys, in America after Sputnik was NASA gets created in 1958 as a response to Sputnik. But Eisenhower doesn't want to hurry it up. He wants a more incremental space program. Kennedy's saying, are we going to be number one? And so once Kennedy's elected, he's not sure what he's going to do. And he waits to get a report by an MIT professor, his science advisor, Jerome Wisner, who later plays a role in environmental history, actually, with Rachel Carson. But Wisner tells Kennedy in his report, I don't think we should put manned space, and I don't think we should race Russia. Kennedy gets this report right at the time of his inaugural, because in between, what should I do? So Kennedy's like, the science people are saying don't race Russia, but I've been on the campaign saying we're going to put an American flag on the moon. And my slogan, the new frontier, what Kennedy called that comes from NASA. That was a NASA phrase from the 1950s, new frontier. I found it in all sorts of NASA periodicals and pamphlets. And history takes over. Kennedy's only president a couple months, and the Soviets put Yuri Gagarin in space. The first human being ever in space. And on Kennedy's watch in April of 1961. And Kennedy's livid. Hugh Sidey of Time magazine was in an Oval Office as a journalist and was sitting there, and Kennedy's screaming, basically. I want to be number one. What do we do? Somebody tell me how to beat them. I don't care if it's the janitor over there. I want to be, this is unacceptable. And what gets greenlit are the Mercury astronauts. Most famously on May 5th, 1961, Kennedy decides he keeps Lyndon Johnson as the head of the space czar for him. So if Alan Shepard goes up in space, first American to answer the Soviet Gagarin in space, if Shepard dies, he's going to blame Lyndon. Alan Shepard goes up, 15 minutes, comes down. Credible pilot, Shepard. He's from New Hampshire. He's from family, was a direct lineage to the Mayflower. The media loves Alan Shepard, and Kennedy's jaw drops at the ratings on TV for Alan Shepard. Holy cow, like space mania. Never before, everybody watching Alan Shepard, and we did it. And Kennedy finds out from James Webb of NASA, we got more to go. We can keep going, and Kennedy sees a political victory with each time we put an astronaut in space. That summer, Gus Grissom will go up. Meanwhile, May 5th, 61, Alan Shepard, May 25th, the same month, Kennedy surprises the country by calling a joint session of Congress in the afternoon and says we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade and bring him back alive. Wow. You know what they said at NASA? Is he crazy? We have no technology to put a man on the moon. We barely got Alan Shepard up there for 15 minutes. We've had more blow-ups here at Cape Canaveral, Florida than successes, and he's hot-dogging going to the moon. McGeorge Bundy, our national security advisor for Jack Kennedy, had the temerity to tell the president, Mr. President, this is what you did. I don't approve of your moon thing. It's a grandstanding play. That's what Bundy said to his face. And Kennedy flares up and says, you don't run for president in your 40s if you don't have moxie, Mac. What's Kennedy doing here? I am telling you, I've read everything and studied Jack Kennedy. I've interviewed all the Kennedy family members. Jack Kennedy, one thing you got to know about him, yes, he was handsome. Yes, he's debonair. Yes, he gives a great speech. He's an incredible salesman. He's smarter than people think, and he's well read. There's a lot about him, but there's one thing you need to know about John F. Kennedy. He wanted to win. He hated losing. It had been psychologically drilled in him, you don't lose. Do you realize Jack Kennedy never lost an election his whole life? He ran for Congress in 1946 and won. He ran in 48 and won. He ran in 50, he won. He ran for the Senate in 52 and won. He ran for the Senate in 58 and won. He ran for president in 60 and won. He doesn't lose. There are dozens of anecdotes of bad sportsman's behavior by the real John F. Kennedy. One of his White House aides, Donald, tells a story. They're playing chess, and he finally is about to he's just made the move that has Jack Kennedy checkmated. And Kennedy takes his knee and bounces the thing up and says, I guess we'll never know who won. Okay, he did that board games with his wife. This is so the idea that we're going to lose to the Soviets in space and he's president isn't going to happen. Because whether he liked it or not, this was the new coin of the realm in foreign policy. If you're not going to fight a proxy war like Korea or what will be Vietnam, then space was the new arena. The big thing politically for Kennedy, he finds space heroes. John Glenn goes up in 1962 and orbits the Earth, and he becomes the new Lindbergh. Glenn's a Marine and the clean Marine. His Friendship 7 capsule, John Glenn, becomes a goodwill ambassador all over the world. People wait for 4 or 5 hour lines just to glance at the capsule that Glenn was in. Glenn becomes a Democrat because Kennedy pulls him in the Democratic Party. In fact, I interviewed Ethel Kennedy, the widow of Robert F. Kennedy, and when her husband is murdered in Los Angeles, and you're seeing the blood there with Sirhan, she goes backstage and runs to call John Glenn so he will look after her children at Hickory Hill in Virginia, her home. Because that's how close Glenn becomes to the Kennedy family. Kennedy basks in the astronauts. They're vigor. They're male fighters. They're the new space age men. And space becomes big. The big thing that Kennedy has to decide after we go to space is who's getting the government contracts for $25 billion. Florida's a big recipient. George Smathers, the senator from here, was Kennedy's closest friend in the U.S. Senate. He also was a segregationist. Kennedy was not. And Kennedy's Justice Department was having to deal with James Meredith integrating University of Mississippi and all the problems in Alabama and civil rights exploding at the same time as Alan Shepard and John Glenn. And the Kennedy-Johnson team come up with an idea to flood the southern zone with money. And so Democratic southern senators won't complain about civil rights because they're getting $150 million, $300 million in places like Houston, Texas, San Antonio, Huntsville, Alabama, Biloxi, Mississippi, Jacksonville, Florida, Cocoa Beach, Florida, Newport News, Hampton, Virginia, Brevard, North Carolina, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, St. Louis, Missouri. It's where the dough's going as a Southern strategy. Because Franklin D. Roosevelt built the Grand Coulee Dam and the Tennessee Valley Authority and WPA bridges, government infrastructure. And Eisenhower built the interstate highway system. Biggest public works project in world history, the interstate highway system. Some people go to China to take a picture of themselves next to the wall. Just go stand at a ramp at I-10 and Kennedy's thinking, what's my big thing? What is the big new frontier project like that? And he honed in on space as economic, call it pork if you like, but that Kennedy was correct that technology corridors were going to be the new thing in the late 20th century, and that you had to bring the money into the southern zone, which he wanted to keep politics with. Lyndon Johnson comes in big here. I remember I told you when Alan Shepard went up, there's a scene I write about in a limo shortly after it. Alan Shepard's in the limousine with President John F. Kennedy, Vice President Lyndon Johnson, and a guy, Newton Minow, of Federal Communications. And Minow tries to make a joke and says, you know what, Alan, if you would have died up there in space, Jack would have blamed the entire thing on Lyndon. And they kind of chuckled, and Kennedy says, no, if he would have gone up and if Alan, you would have died, Lyndon would have been the next astronaut. The point being, they don't really get along that well, but both Kennedy and Johnson firmly believe that space exploration is the big thing in the Cold War and that the money needs to go to the South. And lo and behold, Texas and Florida are the two big beneficiaries. Florida should have had the Manned Space Center. If you were really doing it from a budget-conscious way, Manned Space Center should have been in Florida. There's no need for it to be disconnected from the launch center, but the money needed to be spread. And bids came in. Just some of you may have seen Jeff Bezos of Amazon just did a whole thing like a Willy Wonka ticket for where's my new campus for Amazon. It was like that for space hardware right after Kennedy's speech in '61, and the winning bidder becomes Houston, Texas. Houston is chosen because the head of the Senate Space Appropriations Committee is Albert Thomas, the congressman from Houston. And the money goes into Oklahoma because Senator Robert Kerr of Oklahoma is the head of Senate Space Appropriations. And the head of NASA, James Webb, Kennedy's head of NASA, used to work right up until he was hired by NASA, worked for McGee Kerr Petroleum in Oklahoma. And basically was owned by Senator Kerr. And Lyndon is telling Jack Kennedy, leave these guys to me. I'm pals with all of them, these Southern senators, and we'll do it. And they do it. And Houston overnight changes, guys. It was Bayou City, USA. Now it's called Rocket City. 1962, the Astros come to town. Baseball, Astros. Astro World theme park. Rockets NBA team in basketball. I looked at a yellow pages from that, the difference between pre-Kennedy picking Houston and post. A year after Kennedy picks it, it's like Astro babysitters. Have a moon burger at Bob's Cafe. All of Houston goes space crazed. As well they should have. Big amount of money being poured into Houston and San Antonio. At the time so Kennedy now is committed to going to the moon. By the time when he goes to Houston and says he does that incredible speech, that's in a time of a midterm election, and he's saying, look, and it's true. There were 7 Mercury astronauts. One didn't ever go up with Kennedy in Mercury program. Deke Slayton didn't. But 6 of the astronauts went up. All were successful missions. Kennedy's not bragging. I'm 6 for 6. Okay, it's a real point. And all these aerospace companies are really happy. I mean, this is what Eisenhower warned about, an industrial military complex. Well, Kennedy's embracing it. And at that point, guys, at the end of Kennedy's life, as you know, he dies in Dallas. Space is so much part of him. He's met Wernher von Braun all the time. He goes to Huntsville. He goes to Cape Canaveral. His father's down here in Florida, Jack Kennedy, in Palm Beach, so he visits their compound and then goes to NASA. He's educated himself on it. The day before John F. Kennedy's killed, he is in San Antonio, Texas. And while he's in San Antonio, he's there giving a speech on space medicine and the spin-off technology of it. And in space medicine, Kennedy's dealing with CAT scans, MRIs, foldable walkers, heart defibrillators, respiratory machines, kidney dialysis, all of this medical technology coming through this federal infusion of money for the space program. Kennedy's bragging about it and gives a great speech there. He has Gordon Cooper, one of the Mercury astronauts, at his side the day before he's dead. He asked Cooper to come to Dallas with them. Cooper was supposed to be in the convertible waving next to Kennedy, but he was called away from that at the last minute and didn't go to Dallas, Gordon Cooper. But it was one of the reasons why the convertible was open in Dallas. It was going to be a space hero wave, which Kennedy had done with great effect with other astronauts. And that after San Antonio, he spoke in Houston, and he spoke for a big gala for Congressman Albert Thomas, the head of Congressional Space Appropriations, and Kennedy makes a faux pas. He says, here in Houston, you are responsible, and you have been the beneficiaries of what will be the biggest payroll in payload in space. And then Kennedy, who always a quick recoverer, quick mind, and then said, well, but it's also the biggest payroll here to Houston. And, everybody applauds and all of that. George Herbert Walker Bush was the head of Harris County Republican Party, and I saw a message he released to all Republicans: welcome John F. Kennedy. He's done more for our county than anybody. And then Dallas. And on the way, that fateful day, Kennedy's murdered with his wife Jackie at his side. She's wearing a pink Chanel suit, and his whole head comes off, blood all over her. He was on his way to give a speech on space at the Trade Mart at Dallas, in which he was bragging about how many space satellites he's put up for meteorological forecasting, global positioning. GPS is born out of all this NASA culture. Computer work. Do you realize the microchip of today you all use is created by Jack Kirby, Texas Instruments in late 1950s and 58. So computer technology is getting adapted by NASA. Kennedy was going to give that bravado speech about space, and he dies. And now, there goes the Apollo program. If Kennedy, can we keep it funded? Kennedy's an amazing salesperson for space. It's stunning how good he is. I've listened to every speech he's given on space. You're ready to go sign up when you listen to Kennedy. He was a much more effective communicator than even people could even remember. And everybody knows he was good, but he was really good. But Apollo, incidentally, for young people that are following all this, Mercury astronauts are 1 astronaut in space. Gemini are 2 astronauts in space, and Apollo are 3 astronauts in space. Kennedy fulfilled the Mercury program. Now it's got to move to Gemini. And the first meeting Jackie Kennedy has with the new president, Lyndon Johnson, in the White House, is she says, I want Jack's dream kept alive of going to the moon. And Lyndon says, I will, with Lady Bird there. And he immediately names this the Kennedy Space Center in Florida as the first federal honor for John F. Kennedy's, the Kennedy Space Center. And Johnson, true to his word, continues to push for funding of Apollo, even though he's doing great society programs like Medicaid and Medicare and Clean River and beautification and on, and the Vietnam War. And we're still grandfathered in on the Kennedy effect is going to the moon. It almost gets derailed. Incidentally, people against going to the moon, they're there. There are environmental critics. Rachel Carson was very skeptical in the 50s about this kind of space exploration, using missiles and the fear of militarization of space. Reverend Ralph Abernathy of the NAACP was kind about the astronauts, but said, why aren't we putting this into education and urban poverty issues? Why waste it to go to the moon? Although when Apollo happened, he said something nice, as anybody would. Nobody ever blamed the astronauts for spending. But, on the right, Barry Goldwater didn't want to go to the moon. He said civilians in space is garbage. The money should go to the U.S. Air Force. Walter Mondale and Fulbright were against the moonshot. So it still ran through. It hits its buzzsaw, guys, in 1967 here at Cape Canaveral when Apollo 1 is doing a test And 3 astronauts are incinerated on the launch pad in a fireball. Ed White, Roger Chaffee, and Gus Grissom. But there's still enough gas in the tank to get it into 69. And in 1969, we famously announced we're going to the moon. Neil Armstrong is picked to be the first person on the moon. Armstrong is a civilian, and President Nixon does not want to militarize space or give the idea of militarization of the moon with Vietnam and all. And they become big-time heroes. And 550 million people around the world were like me watching this moment when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon on a rocket built by Wernher von Braun, the Nazi rocketeer. Von Braun, under Jack Kennedy, got the contracts to build the Saturn class of rockets, and von Braun's rockets did not fail. Each of the Saturn rockets, he did incremental testing. They created the module effect where you would dock in space, and then the Eagle would leave the mother spaceship and go on to the moon. And we beat the Soviets. Kennedy had always framed it in sports terms. At my university, I went at the Kennedy Library, saw the speech Kennedy gave, and in handwriting of Kennedy's own hand, last minute he adds, he's saying, people say, why go to the moon? Why climb Mount Everest? Why does Rice play Texas in football? He got a big applause. And then it's the kicker, because it's a challenge. And we beat the Soviets to the moon. One of the nicest gestures our astronauts did, or NASA did, is when last thing Armstrong, if you listen to the tape, says to Aldrin, did you leave the packet? And Aldrin had forgotten, and then suddenly he drops this packet. In that packet were medals of the cosmonauts, Soviets, astronauts, cosmonauts who died trying to go to the moon in their own space program as a healing gesture between the race. No Soviet Union, there's no going to the moon. It's the race that keeps the funding going. And the space race is over at that point. Incidentally, we now know as historians that they were trying to go to the moon up until 67. 68, they had their own Apollo 1-like disaster, dead cosmonauts, engineers at Star City blown up over there. Russia used Kazakhstan as, like we did the South, as an economic development. Kazakhstan got all these space monies out of the Soviets government. And then in 1975, we docked with Russia in space, and it's really over the race. And so we're left with this strange accomplishment of 50 years ago. The first time since the beginning of time, we write for a living. Poets, philosophers have been staring at the moon forever. All of us have been wondering what it's like there. It's the tides of the ocean here in Florida is dictated by the moon. Our calendar is run by the moon. And here we did it. We did it in this kind of Cold War context. And at Mission Control, they loved Jack Kennedy at NASA. I read a letter I found at the Nixon Library and I'll end with this, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who would become a famous senator from New York, and Bill Moyers, who became a big PBS guy, and Moyers was a speechwriter for Lyndon, were lobbying to name the rocket to the moon the John F. Kennedy. And then an H.R. Haldeman gets a hold of this movement, and Nixon's worried Nixon might do it, and he writes to the boss, no, this is a NBC News plot to Kennedyize Apollo 11. And then on another one it says, if you do this, liberals always want more. They'll say you haven't done enough, you didn't name the moon Kennedy. So Nixon won't mention John F. Kennedy's name that whole summer. But at NASA, the second they recovered Armstrong, Aldrin, and Michael Collins in the South Pacific, and they were safe on the USS Hornet, at that very moment on a giant board like this flashed up Kennedy's challenge of May 25th, 1961, put a man to the moon by the end of the decade. And underneath it in big letters, it said, task accomplished, July 1969. And at that same time, on Kennedy's grave at Arlington Cemetery, there was a little note card placed that said, "Mr. President, the eagle has landed." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brinkley. I want to remind everyone that there are books for sale in the back of the room. And there is actually a discount because the book made the New York Times bestseller list. You get a discount. What is the discount?
30% off.
All right. So I know that many of you have questions, and I'll go around and hand you the microphone. Who's got one? Yes.
I was trying to think of a question that Brian Lamb didn't ask you. I was actually at the liftoff of Apollo 11. That was kind of my Woodstock. It was a month before Woodstock, so it was good. I just wondered, when you were interviewing Armstrong, what he thought about kind of by that point, the generations-long failure to advance past Earth orbit, the lack of anything more than kind of just, bare bones funding for NASA over all those decades.
It's a great question. If you didn't hear back there, it's like, what did Armstrong think of after we went to the moon? We seemed to drop the ball on it, or did we drop the ball on it? Incidentally, Armstrong was an engineer from Purdue University, and he was not an emotive person. He was very much a science-driven, straight-ahead person. And so I, as a humanities guy, tried to open him up at one point, and I said, "Mr. Armstrong, don't you ever just go out and look at the moon and think, my God, it's so beautiful and luminous, and like I stood there and got to see Earth?" No. That's the extent of my transcript answer. He didn't like talking in romantic terms about this. It was sort of a mission for him. But he also said, look, it was a weird confluence in the early 60s, computer, radar, a rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, communist totalitarianism versus democratic capitalism. It just happened. Everything, and Kennedy saw that. He was very bright and seized it and moved it forward, and we somehow kept it up. The only reason we did it, guys, I used to think before this book that NASA was the beginning of the technology revolution, and it is. It's the 60s NASA next at Silicon Valley in the 1970s, but it was also the last act of World War II. All of these engineers and people working on the space program, I'm talking about Armstrong and Aldrin and Kennedy, the named people, but the real people that did all the work come out of the World War II experience, which means high risk. Death. John F. Kennedy's brother died on an experimental mission. You're willing to put your life on the line to achieve scientific, military advancement quickly, hurry up industry, hurry up economy. So all of these NASA people, by and large, were products of World War II. So it's this in-between of the end of World War II. Remember, it's 1960 elections, only 15 years after World War II. James Webb, the head of NASA, was a Marine in World War II. Specialty was radar in the Pacific. So many of these people that I write about in the book, and it's a book a lot about engineering, and it's you're not supposed to call von Braun a rocket scientist. He's actually a rocket engineer. I got my book proofread by Michael Neufeld of the Smithsonian Institute, von Braun's biographer, and he took me to the woodshed about 15 times for using the phrase rocket scientist. It's rocket engineer. But Armstrong thought we'll go back someday. I would ask you young people, what's the next moonshot? The term moonshot, incidentally, comes from Wally Moon, a baseball player for the Los Angeles Dodgers, who had hit long home runs in 1959, and Vin Scully, a radio announcer, would go, "There's a moonshot over the left field fence." Now the term moonshot stands for academia, universities working with government, working with the private sector to accomplish something gigantic that's not war. And Buzz Aldrin thinks the new moonshot should be going to Mars. Joe Biden thinks the new moonshot is working with MD Anderson as a cancer shot to find a cure for cancer. I personally think the new moonshot should be an Earth shot to deal with climate change here at planet Earth and not in, at this moment in time. And so there's but what's useful is in this time of Mueller report and all that we're dealing with is there possibility that we can do something big together as Americans beyond just dysfunction in Washington and media dysfunction and all that's going on. We could pull together and do something if we get a collective will on an endeavor. And that way the moonshot's a good example because as much as I could tell you and about the problems with this is a lot of militarization and going to the moon. The peaceful going to the moon was like icing on the cake of the real missile technology. But it was much better to challenge the Soviet Union to a moon race than it is to actually go to war with Russia in a nuclear age. And Kennedy did do nuclear test ban treaties, banning atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons with Russia. And he was working with Khrushchev a lot. At one point, Khrushchev and Kennedy talked about joint going to the moon together, and it melted down. And one of the best things is Khrushchev's son, Sergei Khrushchev, said he asked his father at that time, "Dad, why can't we go to the moon with the Americans?" And he said, "Not going to happen, no." He's like, "Why?" He said, "Because they'll see what we don't have." The Kremlin was bluffing their technology a lot. And if we were more transparent, our space program, than Star City of Russia, so if we saw that they didn't have some of what that they were bluffing they had, we would know that we were really quite supreme in this regard. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for coming here. That was a very inspirational talk, and I'd like to revisit something you mentioned just a few minutes ago about the Earth shot and what our generation wants to see as the next big leap for America and for our country. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on the American public and how it has, over the last few decades, responded to the global environmental crisis in a very different way, from the sensationalism and the awe of the moonshot of the 60s, and what you think it would take for our public to realize that the most important planet and celestial body is in serious danger, and so is our race. What do you think about that?
Great question. Thank you. To have the Earth shot, you do need presidential leadership out of the United States of a very serious kind. You obviously don't have that right now. It's just not there, for one. But number two, and that's just one piece of it. I think we've got to frame things. When I wrote my books on the environment, which I've done a cycle of books on environmental history, when I go out there in America to places, if I tell an audience, a bipartisan audience of people, if I talk about wilderness and don't you love your local lake and don't you want, everybody wants their local lake clean, everybody wants the river clean, everybody wants good forest fires, everybody wants out invasive species, everybody, if you frame it as wilderness or your local places, but as soon as you use the word environment, they think it's like a tree hugger scheme, because it's become so polarized. Environmentalists are seen as Democrats, and the oil and gas lobby is on the Republican side, and we don't have a lot of brave leadership. And it's become that polarized. But we got to get off fossil fuels, guys. We got to do it. And we've got to create a new, the new Green Deal as being proposed has some great ideas in it, but it's going to be a non-starter because of the way it's framed. I think an Earth shot's a better way to frame it, because you're telling Americans more that we can be the champions of the planet, that we can be the good guys. And it creates jobs in the energy sector, the economic thing that Kennedy did with NASA, that this is employment, the new green economy that it'll be. And so it takes an extraordinary amount of leadership and salesmanship. I hope and think it might come, but man, it's getting late. We've had some missed opportunities to pulling out of Paris climate accord and this sort of, we're going in the wrong direction right now, and it's deeply frustrating because when there's a forest fire in California or a super hurricane here and that, it's easy to say, well, that's not climate, is that proof that that's climate change? Prove it. So a way to take a lead, which is going to take a political and public relations campaign of unbelievable kinds. Universities have to get involved, you guys involved. It's just got to be a loud message in 2020 that climate change isn't a back burner issue, but it's a front burner, and it's really the one that's essential for survival.
Yes. First, thanks for coming today and speaking to us again. And my question is, could you comment on Vice President Pence's resumption of the National Space Council and this new target date of 2024 for return to the moon, and just kind of how it's being framed compared to the original moon?
Great question. You guys are asking really good questions. Mike Pence said a few weeks ago in Huntsville, we want to go back to the moon in 4 or 5 years. Well, first off, one problem, I didn't get into it, but it's a lot in my book, that there were 13 women trained to be astronauts, the Mercury 13. They passed all the endurance tests of Randy Lovelace, Dr. Lovelace in New Mexico. They were even had higher marks than the men, but NASA back then picked only white male astronauts. You had to be 5'10". So the Soviets beat us with the first woman in space. Now, we had Sally Ride go into space in 1983, and now, for your guys, young people here, space is a great field. They're jobs because not just NASA, but Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin and the privatization of space and satellites and all. So it's a robust field. I say that if we go back in 4 or 5 years, first off, it should be a woman. We need to have the first woman on the moon. That has not happened. But the problem with what Pence said is you got to fund it. They used to say at NASA, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. And when we went to the moon, 4.5% of the budget, so take 4.5% went to NASA, annual federal budget to NASA. It's now a third of 1%. From a third of 1% to 4.5. So if you're going to do this space stuff, it's expensive. And one of the things I did kind of learn to admire about Kennedy's ability to tell crowds, how he'd constantly say, it is expensive. It's going to cost you 50 cents and you 50 cents a week. And he would do all of that. I mean, I thought it's a little disingenuous to just throw out, we're going to go to the moon, we're going to do these space forces and all, when there's no budget. We're in massive debt and there's no budget, and Earth is hurting right now. One of the great things that came out of the moon program was Earth. You know, Bill Anders' Earthrise photograph from the Apollo astronaut and Whole Earth catalog, and seeing lonely blue-green marble of Earth floating out there, there's a connection to space and the natural world and Earth affairs. Not Armstrong, but many astronauts I've talked to said, I thought we were on a moon mission, but it was really seeing Earth. To many, it was a spiritual moment to be up there and look at our planet like that. No borders, this beautiful blue-green planet. So environmentalism and space, they're both about science. In 1960, guys, scientists were Times People of the Year, generic scientists, 60. We have a president now who's calling climate change a hoax and discarding all the climate scientists. So you're going to have to believe scientists if you're going to move this Earthshot forward. Yeah.
I saw a memorial to JFK in Fort Worth, Texas, that indicated it was the location of his last public remarks. Did he speak about space there?
No. It's accurate, though. His last public remarks from that Houston talk for Albert Thomas, Jackie and Jack Kennedy flew and stayed at a hotel in downtown Fort Worth. They were having a wonderful romantic time together. Their marriage had ups and downs, but they were on a high note. And he spoke outside to people at a breakfast there in Fort Worth. They then flew him from Fort Worth to Dallas because they wanted the TV cameras to show like he's arriving in Dallas. And CBS had created a Southern Bureau, and there were reporters all over, and then they took that fateful card. So officially, the last public remarks of Kennedy were in Fort Worth. Anyone?
I think that's all the questions. Dr. Brinkley, thank you
Thank
so
you,
much
guys.
for being with us.
Thank you to my wife for coming with me, guys. Talk to her one time. Come with me.
And everyone, Dr. Brinkley will be sitting in the back
Sitting up top.
signing books. Don't forget to get a book and get it autographed. And thank you so much again for coming through this incredible storm. I hope your power is back on when you get home. If not.
Hey, how you doing?
That is such a great wish, like, for the power to be back on.